Chapter 4 of Your Wildest Dreams, A Parkinson's Love Story, 2005 to 2007. Because there is no cure for Parkinson's, and because the conventional treatments leave a lot to be desired, many of us who have been touched by the disease end up seeking alternative treatments. Because of this, we all become vulnerable to false claims for remedy and cure. As Andy and I pursued the alternative treatments that made sense to us, we played the role of fool many times, spending our money and energy searching for treatment that claimed it would lessen Andy's symptoms. Before delving into all the options we pursued, I'm going to tell the end of the story. Nothing helped lessen his symptoms except drugs and brain surgery. But without all our attempts with alternative treatments, the drugs and brain surgery would not have worked so well. We discovered one of the many positive outcomes of alternative treatment was that it slowed down the progression. Alternative treatment kept Andy off drugs for 6 years, and that brought him time for the risks associated with conventional treatment to ease. These risks included numerous problems from taking the medications, including dyskinesia and dementia. The surgery Andy ended up having was able to be studied and improved over the 6 years of alternative treatment. We began to understand that many alternative treatments helped to strengthen Andy, but never touched his disease. The drugs helped suppress and control certain symptoms of the disease, but often weakened the man who was taking them. Andy never claimed Parkinson's disease as part of his true self. He thought of it more as a circumstance that he had to live with and deal with. Keeping his true self intact was always important in our approach to living with this disease. Yes, alternative treatment slowed him down from getting on conventional treatment, which had some serious effects. They helped him relax and be at peace and face failures and past trauma that had not been resolved. Alternative treatment reminded him of his true identity by working with aspects of his life that were not part of Parkinson's disease. Every person with any disease has emotional, mental, and spiritual parts of themselves that need to be addressed along with the physical disease. In the later stages of Parkinson's disability, when Andy's constant violent shaking made his true self visually unrecognizable, the alternative treatments touched the man inside and helped him recognize himself, which then helped me find him in the Parkinson's hell. What we learned is that it is all needed, the drugs and the alternative treatments. There was both scam and miraculous healing along both routes, which you'll see throughout our journey. It took much perseverance and time to pursue alternative therapies. As Andy's wife, most of that fell to me. Over the years, I was immersed in, among other things, giving treatments, driving Andy to appointments, filling up 130 capsules a day with herbal powders, reading books, monitoring Andy's progress, and constantly searching for new ways that might work, while also being the breadwinner and keeping up with daily chores. Ironically, I realized the magnitude of what I was doing at the time, but now I can't fathom it at all. It was way too much for one person. Our alternative journey began with Noel Batten and Janice Walton Hadlock. They were the first people we learned about who had cured Parkinson's disease with natural treatments. Noel was from Australia and had written a book, a long one, published online, free for download by anyone interested. We read it. Andy was not very disabled at this point. We were just getting ready to move back home to New Mexico after living most of the past 5 years in Chicago for our daughter's classical ballet training. Noel's book was all about nutrition, exercise, chiropractic alignment, proper rest, and all kinds of lifestyle suggestions. We were looking forward to going home and being healthy. Andy said, "I feel so relieved that this is going to pass." We couldn't completely ignore the fact that we already followed almost every suggestion in Noel's book and had made these positive lifestyle choices for most of our lives. It made me wonder, if doing what we've always done is the cure, then what was the cause? Regardless, we followed Noel's protocol for a few months. Our approach was total immersion. In every healing practice we accepted, we gave it a full try. This was the agreement we'd made with each other. Unfortunately, nothing changed for Andy except that our initial hope wore thin. We tried to set our disappointment aside and moved toward our next possibility for help. When someone you love is diagnosed with an incurable disease, it changes every aspect of your life. People respond to the same situation in many different ways, and we all have some experience with this because these incurable disease diagnoses happen every day. Andy's diagnosis of idiopathic Parkinson's disease in early 2005 inspired us to live in the present and become more aware of the power of staying grounded in the moment at hand. This one choice was what allowed us to successfully try many different treatments for Andy's condition and keep the joy of life alive, while sometimes simultaneously suffering greatly. Andy's suffering was pure and simple. He tried not to allow himself to be burdened by imagined pain, fear, and discouragement. All his life he had studied and learned from great teachers, philosophers, and holy people. Now was his chance to put into practice the magnificent power of withstanding what was real in the present moment. Our lives were filled with challenges, and meeting them this way was our saving grace. Disease is part of life. There are not different rules for its presence. If we know how to live, we know how to live with disease. If we don't know how to live, then it is possible for disease to be a teacher. We began to notice small changes in our lives at first. Andy informed me that he was no longer able to make jewelry on the torch because it was not safe to work with such a hot flame while shaking. His tremor was predominantly on his left side, and naturally he favored his right side. If we were at dinner with friends, he would sit on his hands to keep them still. He began drinking from a straw so as not to spill liquid from a glass or cup. His handwriting became smaller and smaller. These changes happened slowly, and we adjusted accordingly. It was not easy, but it also was not hard. We were aware of living in the present moment and stayed away from societal pressure to fit in as much as we could. Andy adapted. Most of our friends accepted his new condition because he accepted it himself. Andy was still Andy, with his wry, sparkling humor and wonderful conversational skills. In these early years of the disease, both strangers and friends felt compelled to tell me horror stories about someone they knew who had Parkinson's. These unasked-for stories came often enough that I had to make a defense for myself. At the first sign that someone was going to share, I would say firmly, "Please only share this if it is inspiring." But before I mounted that defense, I was told uncountable painful stories of defeat. Our neighbor got Parkinson's and within a few months was all bent over and in a wheelchair, and within a year was dead, one person told me. My mother had Parkinson's and she lost her mind, another said. I cared for my father and he lost his mind, was totally incontinent and bedridden, and lived a long, long time like that, a dear friend informed me. I didn't know why people felt called to share their horrible experiences. I knew that hearing them was not good for me, and I repelled them as much as I could. These people were not heartless. They were stuck in their own realities and for some reason thought they were equipping me to handle different outcomes. I tried to respond with compassion instead of feeling afraid. During this period, I came to know a woman named Karen Harris, who was a powerful body worker with psychic healing gifts and abilities. Her father had lived with Parkinson's, and she was the first person we knew to have personal understanding and experience with the disease. She had been trained in shiatsu techniques and introduced us to the work of Janice Walton Hadlock, who is also a shiatsu practitioner. Janice had started the Parkinson's Recovery Project in Santa Cruz, California. This program was the second of many alternative approaches we tried for Andy's condition. Noel Batten's treatment had not helped, but because our lifestyle was almost the same as his protocol to cure Parkinson's, we never actually stopped his recommendations. We downloaded and read Janice's free book about her project, and we were very hopeful. One of the qualifications to be part of her project was that Andy could not be taking any of the medication commonly prescribed for Parkinson's. Early on, Andy had chosen to stay off the drugs, and he had stuck with that choice. The side effects we knew about all came from various cocktails of medications for Parkinson's, and they included hallucinations, dementia, and death. Because of this, Andy was a candidate for treatment at Janice's program. We saved our money and flew to Santa Cruz for a week of treatment and learning. We felt excited, like we were going on a vacation. I loved Santa Cruz. We stayed in a place in the hills above town called the Land of the Medicine Buddha. It was a beautiful retreat center, which made our trip feel even more like a vacation. Giant redwood trees surrounded the place, and we walked past a huge Buddhist prayer wheel as we wheeled our bags to our quiet, pristine room. The morning after we got there, we drove our rental car down toward the ocean for Andy's first appointment with a man named Chris. Chris began the session by asking Andy a lot of questions, then gave us our first lesson in FSR, or Forceless Spontaneous Release. This technique addressed one of the conditions that the Parkinson's Recovery Project believed was responsible for the progression of the disease, a blocked energy channel. This FSR work was simple, non-invasive, and Andy said it felt wonderful. Basically, it was comprised of holding the patient's foot for long periods of time and was intentionally non-intentional. Chris performed this technique on Andy every day and taught me to do it as regular therapy to do when we returned home. Andy relaxed and his tremors lessened during the treatments. This was encouraging, sort of. My pragmatic self was also aware that his symptoms abated like this every day when he meditated, did yoga, received a massage, or relaxed in a reclining chair reading a book. The FSR work was said to be different because it was addressing the backward running of Andy's stomach channel meridian, according to the Chinese medicine map of the body's electrical energy system. Of course, relief only lasted while Andy was comfortable and his foot was being held, but we now had hope of reversing his problem through this process. One of the causes of Parkinson's, according to Janice, was said to be emotional trauma. Unresolved trauma can create a chronic state of using the sympathetic nervous system. Healthy people naturally go back and forth between the relaxed parasympathetic and the hyper-alert sympathetic systems. Parkinson's patients are stuck in the hyper-alert sympathetic system, and through correcting of the backward-running meridian, combined with emotional release and processing, Janice believed they could heal themselves. All these ideas made sense to us at the time. Every day we had appointments with the different practitioners from the Parkinson's Recovery Project, and we began to explore Andy's emotional life in depth. After the appointments of the day, working with several practitioners from Janice's team, we'd walk on the beach, watch surfers, and eat fabulous vegetarian food before returning to our redwood forest retreat to relax and practice what we were learning at the appointments. One of the most common early Parkinson's symptoms is loss of smell. Andy had already experienced this, but one day in Santa Cruz while walking on the beach, Andy could suddenly smell the ocean sea scent. We took this sudden ability, though it only lasted that day, as a hopeful sign. We left Santa Cruz with new ways to approach Andy's condition and returned home determined to follow the protocols we had learned. At that point, we fully expected Andy to heal. At home, we set up a routine of foot holding several times a day using the FSR method. Holding another person's foot in both hands, sitting in a comfortable position, and holding space for healing turned out to be more exciting than I ever could have imagined. By that point, I had become a professional massage therapist and Reiki practitioner and was using these forms of therapeutic touch to ease all kinds of illness in my clients. At first, working with my own husband in this way seemed silly and boring, until after a while I began to feel a whole world of movement within Andy's foot. I held both of his feet in each session, holding one at a time for about 30 minutes. Though they appeared still, I began to feel fluid moving and gurgling. I felt bones align and small pops of energy. I began to feel what I identified as chi moving like a river within his foot. The trainers I had worked with in Santa Cruz had told me I may feel the chi, and it was exciting for me. We were in touch with the Parkinson's Recovery Project, and they were encouraging and told us we were making great progress. We mined Andy's past for unresolved emotional trauma. We shed many tears as we left the present and revisited Andy's mom's sudden illness and death while he served in the military. He never returned for a funeral or memorial service because there wasn't one. We unearthed his fears about going to Vietnam and being a soldier who had been trained to be in battles. Though he ended up being given a desk job, he had lived with the uncertainty of his fate and felt that fear all the way to Vietnam. Andy talked about and grieved lost opportunities in his life. We relived his disappointment of choosing not to attend college at the University of Oregon and run with the famous track team coached by Bill Bowerman, Instead, he went to Oregon State and got locked into a major he wasn't interested in. Then he couldn't correct his mistake because any changes in course during that time automatically bumped one into being drafted and sent to Vietnam. After he returned from Vietnam, there were no jobs available in Andy's chosen career path. He, along with many soldiers, received scorn and disrespect from the country they had fought for, since public sentiment was against this war. Andy had come to terms with the fact that the war had permanently taken away opportunities in his life. Our digging into the pain and suffering of his young life eventually allowed some healing to happen. Andy had survived his fair share of losses, this was certain, as we cried together for months about the pain and losses he endured during his 60-plus years. And as I spent hours every day holding his feet, I heard my pragmatic voice once again. Doesn't everybody have traumas and losses? I thought to myself. If trauma and loss is universally part of the human condition, how can it cause Parkinson's? Why doesn't everybody have Parkinson's? We kept up this routine for the better part of a year. I would ask friends to hold Andy's feet when I would travel to Chicago for work. I had to leave for a week every month to keep us financially afloat. I had developed a massage clientele years before who were loyal and paid me well. Before I left each month, I would cook many meals for Andy to eat while I was away, and we'd stock up on crackers and cheese because it was easier for him to feed himself those foods. He got very tired of crackers and cheese as this went on for years. I stayed with my parents whenever I was in Chicago and worked as much as I was able to every day before returning to Andy. This work was intense and I would return tired, but it was also a break from the duties I had taken on in caring for Andy. Holding his foot every day was becoming tedious and hard to fit into my life of many responsibilities. After many months of talk therapy with one another, Andy and I were both feeling ready to live in the present once again and not focus so intently on all the painful experiences of the past. There was a new lightness in Andy's spirit after he released all that sadness from his life, and the foot-holding had given him a daily sense of comfort and support. The only unfortunate part of all of it was that Andy's Parkinson's symptoms overall were not improving. In fact, they were getting worse. We asked the Parkinson's Recovery Project repeatedly to allow us to talk with someone who had recovered. We were repeatedly told that although many had recovered, no one wanted to come forward publicly. This was the only facet of our experience with this treatment that stunk of fraud. Every other aspect was full of professional, compassionate care. Although the Parkinson's Recovery Project team had helped us gain an understanding of the physiological and psychological parts of the disease, we discussed our choices and felt perhaps we'd been fooled into believing these treatments would help. It was a relief for me to stop holding his feet 3 times a day and to get on with the challenge of managing his daily needs, earning our living, and taking care of myself. After stopping our FSR practice, we discovered the next remedies in our treatment plan. Ted was a local grief counselor who was very well known in our town. He was the dearest man with the brightest smile, and after being told about his work by a friend we trusted, we began to hear his name mentioned all the time. He officiated at my sister's wedding. He saved me from insanity during my divorce. He is like an angel. Andy made an appointment. He talked with Ted for an hour every week for several months. It was time well spent. I could see Andy gaining strength of spirit from these conversations. Ted was not a formulaic counselor. He met each client where they were, and together they created ways to accept, approach, and make better the issue at hand. After every session, Andy would come home and share with me parts of what they had worked on. Andy is a thoughtful and philosophic man, and he enjoyed these sessions. My guess is that he gave as much as he got, and Ted received new ideas from having Andy as a client. Andy is also a practical man. As enjoyable as these sessions were, there came a time when he told me that he and Ted mutually agreed that what had needed to be accomplished was done. We needed the money we were paying Ted for other things. We eventually met Sean and Yvette, who were a young couple offering meditation and channeled healing each week for a small donation. Sean would go into a state of trance and enter a room filled with individuals, including me and Andy, who were personally meditating and awaiting his entrance. It was dramatic seeing Sean half carried and half dragged down the center aisle. His body was limp as he was placed into a throne-like chair. We all sat on the floor, watching him attain his channeling posture. People were brought forward to him by the volunteers who helped us find our places on the floor. When Andy and I took our turn, I found myself putting aside skepticism and going forth openly. He always channeled St. Michael, Raphael, or Mary Magdalene when we were there. Each time was the same. He said, "There is great love here between you two. You have been hurt by many people and must now forgive. This illness is not easy to heal. Go in peace." When we left the meeting, I always had my own shaking episode, which was uncomfortable. I would shiver and feel woozy for an hour until I calmed down. Sean and Yvette were frequently likened to John of God in Brazil. We had been told that perhaps we should go to Brazil to see John of God, but so far our finances hadn't allowed for that option. After about 10 visits to the channeling sessions, I felt uncomfortable with my own stress in the process. We let it go and moved forward to other possible remedies. House, 2006. Our life was getting harder, and I was beginning a phase where I had too much to do and no choice except to do it. Our daughter Alana was a college student in New York, and we were struggling to help her with expenses for textbooks and other necessities. We worried that she was taking on a lot of debt for tuition, although she had received the highest scholarship offered by Bard College. Andy's condition limited our ability to earn money in the ways we had always relied on. A very dear friend, Lynn, hired Andy to manage some repairs and upkeep of her vacation home, which was about 20 minutes away from ours. He could still drive and enjoyed working in the privacy of this empty home. Andy had always loved making improvements to and building interesting places. It was tragic that he was slowly losing his capacity to engage in physical sports, artistic work, and even cooking and writing as Parkinson's began to compromise his fine motor skills. It was an enormous help, both financially and emotionally, for Andy to have some work. We felt great joy knowing our friend loved us enough to support us this way. She got the best work Andy had in him, and his best work with Parkinson's was better than 90% of work done by people without Parkinson's. The house truck that Andy had built as our family home was still livable for us, but aspects of maintaining our home on wheels were becoming more difficult. Hauling our 5-gallon water jugs was now mostly my job, and they were too heavy for me alone. I was concerned about the possibility of Andy falling while walking across our uneven dirt driveway and through the trees on our land to our outhouse each morning. Climbing up the stepladder to our loft bed was not as easy for Andy as it used to be. Our daughter Alana was a college student in New York, and we were struggling to help her with expenses for textbooks and other necessities. We worried she was taking on a lot of debt for tuition, although she had received the highest scholarship offered by Bard College. Andy's condition limited our ability to earn money in ways we had always relied on. I was trying to do more massages as this was becoming our main income. We were barely making it financially. Some friends in Taos recommended a doctor for Andy to see in Santa Fe. They had met a man who had Parkinson's and said this doctor had helped him. Dr. Flate was very expensive for us, but how could we not try? She was willing to be paid on a payment plan, so Andy began regular acupuncture with her, and she prescribed large packets of herbs for Andy to take every day. We also made initial inquiries about stem cell implant treatment for people with Parkinson's. Stem cell research had stalled in the U.S. because of laws restricting funds for scientists doing this research. We found much was happening outside of our country and looked into treatments and results in Germany and China. I had an interview phone call with a salesperson from the German stem cell clinic. They explained their system to me, which was removing stem cells from the patient and then re-injecting them into the spinal cord, hoping the cells would migrate to the brain and help the neurological disease. "What success have you experienced with this treatment for Parkinson's?" I asked. The man answered, "Oh, it seems to help some people." "How much does this treatment cost?" Of course, he answered that one more specifically, $10,000, plus travel and lodging for a week. "Would you have this treatment yourself if you or a loved one had Parkinson's?" I asked. "If I could afford it, I would consider it," he said. "I certainly wouldn't refinance my home to do it. This is a last resort for most people." I hung up, grateful for his honesty. We could not afford it, and it didn't sound that promising. We also checked into work being done with stem cells for Parkinson's at a hospital in Beijing, China. In Germany, the entire treatment took a week. In China, we learned it was a 3-month process and cost $30,000, plus all travel expenses. The results in China seemed much more promising, but the cost was prohibitive for us. We put stem cell treatment on the back burner. Andy continued with Dr. Flate in Santa Fe. I was flying to Chicago every month to do massage work and frantically trying to keep up the payments. We owed her thousands of dollars after several months. Unfortunately, nothing had changed for Andy except now we had this debt. The doctor said to keep at it because healing takes time. It was a terrible dilemma. Andy told her that it would take us many months to pay her, and she agreed to that. Months after we had suspended her services, I began receiving phone calls from her. She seemed to call me at random times every few days while I was working. She wanted money. Dr. Flate, we told you it would take time, and we are paying you as much and as quickly as we can. Now I must go, as I have to start a massage now. This became something I recited to her for weeks, until finally she became angry. Mrs. Heath, you get more massages than anyone I've ever known. Why can't you stop this luxury for yourself and pay me what you owe? I was stunned. Dr. Flate, I am not receiving massage. I am giving it. I am a massage therapist. There was an embarrassed silence and a stammered goodbye. I never heard from her again, even after we paid our last payment and were free of that debt. The mainstream Parkinson's drugs still had all the potentially devastating side effects they had had when we first considered them, and so they stayed on the back burner too. After successfully paying off our debt to Dr. Flate, we decided to keep working and save for a trip to India to realize a long-time dream we'd had. India, 2007. Many years before, a friend had shown me photographs of an orphanage and boarding school near Dehradun. The faces of the children enchanted me, as they did Andy and Alana. We saved and planned to go over for 2 months in the summer of 2007 and volunteer ourselves for whatever they needed. This dream had begun in 2005 when Andy was newly diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and his symptoms were noticeable, but not completely disabling. We didn't want to miss out traveling to India because of this disease. The idea was to volunteer for a month or longer with our daughter Alana, who at the time was in her first year at college. We ended up returning over and over again. Every visit was magical, but our first stay was an initiation of sorts. India is not an easy country to visit. Like every visitor, our senses were bombarded by the absence of quiet or privacy. The unfamiliar cultural divide between males and females scared me. We arrived in New Delhi at night, bleary-eyed after a 15-hour plane ride. The humid heat hit us like a wave as we found a taxi to our guest house for the night. The city was as quiet as it ever would be, and that first impression remains vivid in my mind. There was no place for many of the Indian people to live. We saw groups gathered in makeshift homes made with tarps and cardboard, where they laid on cots. There were piles of moldering, stinky trash everywhere. We saw open fires burning under highway bridges with people gathered around them cooking. It was too hot to want a fire for warmth. Our guest house was in an area that was walled off, far from the city, and we had to pass a guard and show him our passports. It was cleaner and less crowded there, and I was grateful for the protected space. We went to our rooms, purified drinking water for ourselves with the pump and filter we had brought, and laid in our freezing, air-conditioned rooms, waiting for the morning. I luxuriated in being still, and slowly but surely my thoughts began to cooperate and calm after the busy chaos of long travel. At the crack of dawn, we were back in a taxi and taken to the train station, which was swarming with travelers, commuters, porters, and monkeys. We were distracted by the monkeys, but managed to wind our way through the crowd and find our seats in the first-class car. I sat in the aisle seat, and our ride to Dehradun was 7 hours long. It felt like we were watching a travel movie about India. and my eyes were glued toward the window with the scenery rushing by. Other trains shot past on the adjacent tracks, and some of the cars were packed like sardines with Indian people hanging out the windows. Their colorful clothing blew in the wind as they tried to find some breeze in the 115-degree heat. We were freezing in our car's air conditioning. There seemed to be only two temperatures in India, hot and cold. I cannot emphasize how horrible it was to be so cold. We emerged from New Delhi into rolling fields dotted with people, and it looked picturesque until we looked more closely and noticed they were squatting and doing their business. India was full of surprises at every glance. I don't think there was any way to prepare for an experience traveling there. One just plunges in and adapts as needed, and we found it enlivening. We were met at the train station by the staff from the orphanage, and right away I was handed a small child called Dimple, whose smile made the reason for his name obvious. We got into an SUV and drove for about an hour. We passed through the teeming and steaming city of Dehradun. We drove by a slum made of black tarps, cardboard, and stray pieces of metal situated next to a dry river. We continued up into rural hills and wound our way through smaller and smaller villages. We saw people lying on cots and sitting in rusted metal chairs, whiling away the day in tiny stores and cafes that each sold only a handful of items. Eventually, we came to the gates of the orphanage. Our car drove into a haven of green fields and various structures around a couple of luxurious-looking tents. We were dropped off and met by Anita, the owner, who showed us our rooms. We were to stay in a 2-room building with screened windows, heavy metal doors, and a thatched roof. Each room had 2 cots made up into comfy-looking beds and some shelves for our stuff. The floors were bare concrete, and there were narrow homemade brooms to sweep them with. Anita told us we should rest. We acquiesced and fell into the cots, sinking gladly into a jet-lagged sleep that felt like heaven. I awakened hours later to the sound of female voices calling out to each other. Andy was still sound asleep, but I stood up and saw several women high up in the trees of the forest outside my window. They looked like exotic jungle creatures in their bright-colored salwar kameez shifts of magenta, citrine, and cobalt. I watched as they cut branches down with hand saws, and men below dragged the branches toward the orphanage. I saw later, as we sat with the other volunteers eating a meal, that the branches covered plants in the garden and saved them from the hot sun. The women in the trees were called Didis, and they worked tending the children, housekeeping, and doing chores. The men were called Bais and did all the heavy work of gardening, repairs, building, and cutting and hauling wood from the forest for the cooking fires. These were paid workers, and they worked hard and relentless hours. Anita was there when we woke up and treated us as welcome guests, serving the legendary chai. We sipped the sweet, milky ambrosia. Chai was offered many times and every day. Next, we ate delicious rice and dal and vegetables from the garden, and afterward we met the children. There were 4 volunteer teachers already there from England, Germany, and Austria. They had been teaching the 4 classes that the 65 kids were divided into, that Alana and I were going to take over. Andy was told that he was not going to teach. Anita had other plans for him that she would reveal soon. The kids had been working on a dance as part of our arrival welcome, which they performed for us in a big round tent on the orphanage grounds that was used for gatherings and special events. The kids ranged in age from about 2 up to about 11 years old, and we were delighted by their dancing. Afterwards, we sat on the stoops in front of our rooms, and one by one each child gave us a hug and said, "Welcome, ma'am," or "Welcome, sir." The warmth and innocence of their small-armed hugs and faces of pure love moved us. These children's faces were the living, breathing reality behind the images I had seen in the photos my friend had taken that had motivated us to come halfway around the world. Andy's obvious symptoms of Parkinson's didn't seem to matter much in India because suffering was integrated into the culture. Andy had a break from being in the spotlight. Alana and I were determined to be caring teachers to these kids who we were told had lost so much before ending up at the orphanage. We all felt like we'd landed in the place we needed to be at that time.